Good evening, everyone. We'll make a start. I expect more people to be joining in the next few minutes, but it might as well make a start. Right, can you all see my screen? Let me just make sure I have shared, but just give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen. Okay. Right. So this week, as you can probably see, I've listened to a few of your comments over the past 3 or 4 weeks now since we've been doing this English. I've had multiple people asking me about whether we can do more literature-based things. Specifically, multiple people have been asking me about Macbeth. And I've heard your answers, and yes, okay, we're going to do some Macbeth because this is a text that most of you, if not all of you, will be studying at GCSE if you're not already studying. So I thought, where best to start than context? Because as we'll go over, context is around 15 to 20% of your entire exam mark. And being able to understand the play in the context of when it was written is an extremely important skill that will help you to answer your questions in more detail. But before we begin with that, I thought let's do a tiny bit of brief revision on some new words that we have gone over the past month or so. Just so that you keep them in your brain. And again, I keep reiterating this to you, but I encourage you to use them outside of class. Try use them with your friends, with your family. Try writing them down in stories, because when it comes to GCSE, for your creative writing question, you get marked on being able to use higher level and unique words. So it's useful to remember them now because they will come in very useful, I guarantee, later down the line. So we're not going to do too much with this. We're just going to go over them, just as sort of a brief revision more than anything else. But we started with last week, we looked at specifically the Gothic genre. So these are our more sort of gloomy, darker stories. The ones with a dark setting tend to be in isolated places like castles or abandoned mansions, that sort of thing. Dark clouds, rainy skies. You tend to get innocent characters with the more sort of darker characters that have a side motive. So you could get words on our left-hand side, such as apprehensive. And we discussed this to mean worried or nervous. So if someone is apprehensive, they're hesitant or sort of scared about doing something. If you do something with apprehension, because we can also use it in the tense, in the present tense, if you do something with apprehension, you do it with worry in mind. You're thinking about the potential negative consequences of it. If something is dreary, so our adjective of dreary are describing words. It means something that is dull or bleak or potentially lifeless. So think of the grey sky. We could describe a grey sky full of clouds as being dreary. It's very dull. Nobody likes it. It gives very negative vibes. If something is macabre, we discussed it as being potentially horrifying. It could sometimes involve death or injury, but most often than not, it's something that's sinister, something that's dark, something that's gory. If something is eerie, this is a lovely one to use in tones and atmospheres. So in your essays, if you were to link to your language essays to do with tone, you could say something has an eerie tone or an eerie atmosphere, which would mean that it makes the reader feel very strange, very scared, because it evokes a sense of mystery, but not necessarily good mystery where you're feeling like adventurous. It's more negative mystery, where you're feeling like something potentially bad could happen around the corner, and it gives you this uncomfortable, unsettling feeling that we describe as being eerie. Similarly, you might get foreboding. So this is when something tells you or gives you a feeling that something bad might happen later down the line. So I could say it could be foreboding, and sometimes we relate this to settings. So again, if I had a gloomy sky, I could say that is foreboding, that it's giving me the sense that I'm not going to have a very good day, or that something bad is going to happen to me later in the day. If something is desolate, we describe it as being empty or lonely without life. So you could describe a desert as being desolate because nobody lives in the desert. You barely find any animal species. Apart from cacti, there are very rarely any plant species in the desert. So we describe it as being desolate because it's empty, it's lonely, it's without life. If something is gruesome, it's potentially shocking and unpleasant. So it could be gory, not necessarily, but if something is gruesome, it's something that is so shocking because it's gives you this surprise, uncomfortable feeling. Something is sinister, it gives you the impression that it's evil. So we tend to describe in horror movies and horror novels about apparitions and ghosts being potentially sinister. A demon could be sinister, something that has evil intent that wants to do you harm. If you have a feeling of being melancholy, it's when you have a feeling of sadness or gloom. Melancholy doesn't necessarily have to be negative sadness. It could be a reflective kind of sadness, but it's sadness all the same. This feeling of being inside your head and feeling very relaxed and melancholic. If something is an apparition, it is a ghost. We've got our noun of an apparition. It's a synonym of the word ghost, a more fancy word, higher level word for ghost. Similarly to apprehensive, if you were to feel tentative, another synonym of apprehensive is again feeling uncertain or hesitant or not fully confident about doing something. So I could approach a task in a tentative way or tentatively, and I'd be doing so again with worry in the back of my mind. I'd be approaching it not fully confident. If I was resilient, I'd be determined. I'd be showing strength to carry on through a hard time. I'd be able to pick myself up off the ground and carry on. I'd be showing resilience, or if I was to use it in an adjective form, a describing word, I could say that I am resilient. Okay, the week before that, we went over a short story about a young romance, and I gave you some of these words as well. So, meticulous. If I was to do something meticulously, I'd be doing it with care. I'd be doing something very precisely. So in the example that we came across, our protagonist character was folding a letter meticulously. He wanted to do it precisely. He wanted to make no mistakes. That is to do something meticulously. If I was to glare at somebody, the verb here to glare, the doing word, I would be staring at somebody with anger. I'd be staring directly at them with intention. Reluctance or to be reluctant is very similar to apprehensive and tentative. It's to do something unwillingly. So it's when you don't want to do something, you might approach it with reluctance. If I was feeling bewildered, I would be feeling very confused. Deflated, very similar to melancholy, except it's a feeling of being disheartened. Melancholy is a feeling that could possibly have introspective, not necessarily negative connotations, whereas being deflated does tend to have nearly always negative connotations. Think of it like a balloon. If a balloon is deflated, it's not got any air in it, it's not got purpose. So if I was feeling deflated, I would potentially feel without purpose. If I was to do something adamantly, or if I was adamant, I'd be doing something not wanting to change my mind. I'd be absolutely certain that I am right. So if in an argument I'm saying I'm absolutely correct, and the other person saying they're correct, I might be adamant. I might say to them, I am absolutely right and you are wrong, and therefore I'd be showing adamant. If something is ominous, very similar to eerie, it's when something is sort of threatening, it's giving a negative, foreboding vibe that something bad might happen. If I was to linger, the verb linger, I'd be hanging around. Smells can linger, people can linger. This is a good verb maybe to use in an example of personification. So if you were to write in your creative writing about personification, lingering is a great thing that you can have double entendres for. Something that's chaotic, is disorganized and wild, and we're going to come across chaos quite a lot today when looking at Macbeth. Timid is shy or fearful, and then vibrant is to be full of color or energy. And vibrant is a lovely one, again, to use for personification, because vibrant has multiple meanings. It doesn't just have to be color, it could also be energy. So a person can be vibrant. It means they can be full of energy, they can be happy, they're full of life, conveying so much positivity. Okay, so as a general sort of closure on these words, I'm going to offer you optional homework to do. Again, these sessions that I'm running are not mandatory, but I think they really will help you develop your English skills. And so I'm going to give you an option. If you want to send it to me, if you want to send it to the business email, it will get to me and I will mark it. So if you think it's beneficial to you, which I think is beneficial or will be beneficial to you, I recommend doing one of these. So last week we covered the Gothic genre. I challenge you to write a short story in the style of a Gothic novel using 10 or more of those words. And I'll go back in a minute for you to screenshot them in case you want them. And as a little challenge, I'm going to test you. I'm going to ask you to try and use at least 3 language devices. So a couple of weeks ago, we did a revision session on question 2 of paper 1 about language analysis. So these sort of things, and we'll cover them again today if you need them. But that's, for example, personification, similes, metaphors, alliteration, onomatopoeia, rhetorical questions. All of those are examples of language devices. So I challenge you to use these words as part of a short story. Or if you really don't want to do that, read a short story. I think it would really be beneficial for improving your English skills to read. Just reading 10 minutes a day, honestly, will improve your comprehension abilities massively. You'll learn so many new words. You'll feel so much more confident in terms of speaking. So I really, really recommend reading. And The Monkey's Paw is an example of a sort of modern Gothic story. So linking to what we did last week. And you can find it free on Google. If you just type it in and put PDF, it will come up first search. It's only 9 pages, so it's not a long one. It'll only take you 20 minutes or so, but I would heavily recommend. And I've given you some comprehension questions below. And we are going to cover these next week, so you don't have to do this, but I recommend getting ahead. Just having a bit of a think, taking into account everything that we've covered over the past 3 weeks in the terms of how to answer these types of questions. And it will help when you get to your GCSEs. So let me go back to the keywords. So if anyone want to screenshot it, you can. Otherwise, we'll move on. I'll just give you 20 seconds or so if you want to take these. Right. Okay, then. Let's get on to what we're actually going to do today. Again, I've listened. You wanted to do Macbeth. We're doing Macbeth. We're going to do literature today. And where best to start than context. In your exam, 6 marks out of the 30 for your exam paper, if you're doing AQA, will be context marks. Context purely refers to what's going on at the time. So when this play was written, what were the beliefs of the time? What were the fears of the time? What was historically going on that we can link to this play? And that's the best place to start, because from there you can sort of build an idea of how to analyze quotes. So let's run through this. We looked last week at the Gothic genre. Macbeth is a tragic play. The tragic genre is a different style of writing. So the tragic genre is a literary form that deals primarily with human suffering, moral conflict, and the downfall of a central character. Often due to a combination of fate, personal flaws, and circumstances beyond their control. And its purpose is to evoke pity and fear in the audience to convey a moral lesson. So we're going to start to look and unpick what that means. A little bit of history for you. Tragedies began in ancient Greece. They're not a new thing. A tragedy was first invented in Athens, and it was normally for religious festivals. So, for example, in honor of the Greek god Dionysus, and tragedies were originally performed with a chorus. And all that means is there was a big group of people. Think about when you go see a play at the theatre, you get background characters. You might get 10 actors all making the world of the play real, seem bigger. And that's the role of a chorus in ancient Greece. And they were tended to be performed in large amphitheatres. And the typical structure included, very similar to today, a sort of exposition, which is the equivalent of a prologue, the rising action, which was the parados, the episodes, which is sort of the climax, and then the sort of conclusion, which was the exodus. So very similar to today's modern arc, which we looked at a few weeks ago. Now, Aristotle, you might have heard of Aristotle, was a Greek philosopher who kind of proposed the idea of a tragedy. He thought that it should come or emphasize three different things. Firstly, a catharsis, and we'll cover this again in a sec. That all that means is sort of the emotional purging at the end of the play. So by the time you get to the end of the play, you should feel bad for the character. You should feel something for the main character. Particularly, maybe relief or sadness tends to be related to catharsis. A hamartia is a tragic flaw or an error in judgment. And we'll come across again peritheia and anagoresis, which just means the reversal of fortune. And we'll come across this again in a sec. Now, Greek versions of tragedies tended to focus on single characters who committed questionable acts of morality and therefore suffered consequences because of doing these things. And they were often placed in the context of sort of large cosmic forces, so in terms of the Greek gods, who would play influence on their lives. And the Greeks believed that people's fate was predetermined before birth. So our characters, it didn't matter what they did, or what actions they came up with, nothing could change their fate or what was going to happen to them in the afterlife. So the plays sort of acted as a moral message more than anything else, and reflected the general public of the time. Okay. Next, we have our medieval tragedies. So these are sort of the fourth, let's say 9th to 14th century sort of England. Now, compared to Greek tragedies, the medieval ones sort of focused more on Christianity because that was sort of big at the time. It sort of reflected the change of rulership in England when Christianity really sort of took off in England. They sort of focused more on individual flaws, sort of divine punishment, this idea that God is going to punish you for your sins. And they sort of reflected the fears of the time. Because when Roman rule in Britain finished, the medieval world became more centered on a different version of Christianity. And this idea of salvation, that God will forgive us and we'll be able to move into heaven even despite our sins. So the concept of tragedy wasn't necessarily about this emotional purging, the catharsis, but more of a warning against sin. So it was sort of a moral message of why you shouldn't do bad things. And it was taught that only God's kingdom was eternal and that earthly glory always ends in death or ruin. So those characters who do sinful things, who do bad things, will get punished. And that sort of brings us on to our idea of Renaissance tragedy. So this is our Shakespearean tragedies, the 14th and 17th century. The Renaissance sort of marked a major revival and transformation of the tragic genre, blending the sort of classical ideas of the Greek tragedy with the more humanist and psychological ideals of ideas of the time. The Renaissance, all that means is it's a cultural movement across Europe, and it sort of revived interests in sort of like classics, art, science, humanity. And in literature, this meant returning to sort of the Greek ideas of purging the soul. Okay. So, in terms of Shakespearean tragedies, then, because Macbeth was written by a playwright called William Shakespeare, and he believed that tragedies should focus specifically on a more intense character arc. They should focus on the morality of human psychology, of why we make the decisions that we make, therefore bringing more philosophical depth into plays. He often did so with more poetic language and often invited the idea of soliloquies into his plays. So if you study Macbeth, you'll know that Macbeth has several long soliloquies that kind of define the characters of the play. They sort of present major moments where our characters reflect on their actions, reflect on their thoughts, their feelings, and therefore convey all of that to the audience. And Shakespeare often uses these to sort of tell us things about the characters. So Shakespearean themes differed between each play. And we are going to look specifically at Macbeth, but it's worth looking at contextually other plays. So, for example, Macbeth is very much about ambition and power and violence and guilt. This idea of appearance versus reality, things aren't always what they seem. Whereas something like Othello is more about race, about jealousy, about manipulation. And Hamlet is about revenge, madness. morality and indecision. And then Romeo and Juliet is about love, acting impulsively and being loyal to one's family. So, a very quick comparison between the types of tragic genre is that obviously you can see on the right, the Renaissance or Shakespearean tragedies focus a lot more on the inner flaws of the character, the choices that our character is going to make. Our character is very much a noble person that we'll see in a second, more humanized. So not a caricature, very much a based in reality character. The purpose of our Renaissance Shakespearean tragedy is catharsis. It's to give a moral message about the human experience, about psychology, and it often has a looser structure that's more rich in subplots. Okay. Often, the tragic genre will include supernatural elements. In Macbeth, it's very much based in witches. However, we do get the ghost of Banquo. In Hamlet, we get his father's ghost. So we do get a lot of supernatural elements that Shakespeare likes to bring in. And he does this for several reasons. And we're going to explore the witches a bit more later. And one reason he does this is to drive the plot. Often supernatural characters play quite huge roles within the plot of the play. So, for example, in Macbeth, in Act 1, Scene 3, Macbeth and Banquo come across the witches on the heath, and they give prophecies about their lives. They predict things that are going to happen in the future. And Macbeth goes away and takes these, and he becomes spurred with ambition. And that's what kind of spurs him into doing these bad, negative actions. So without the witches, there's an argument of would he have ever done the bad things that he did? We also use the supernatural to explore more psychological conflicts. So, for example, the supernatural often reflects a character's sort of inner turmoil or guilt, or maybe even descent to madness. So, ghosts, witches, omens, and even hallucinations often symbolize mental breakdown or moral corruption. I'm going to explore contextually why this is in a second. So, for example, we talked about witches, but hallucinations occur in Macbeth. For example, his Act 2 soliloquy, he sees a floating dagger coming towards him. Later, he sees Banquo's ghost. All of this reflects or symbolizes his guilt and paranoia about the actions that he's about to do or has done. So the supernatural externalizes what's happening inside of a character's mind. It's more about psychology than magic. They also reflect the beliefs of the time. So again, we'll see what life was like in Jacobean England, but they reflected beliefs of the time. So Elizabethan and Jacobean audiences believed a lot in ghosts and witches and the influence of fate. And often these supernatural elements felt very real to these people at that time, and very powerful, often quite frightening to them. And they were often sort of moral omens as to keeping people on the straight and narrow, making sure people don't commit sins. So including them in the play basically makes them more relatable and more culturally resonant. And then finally, supernatural is often used to question fate and free will and moral order. So are people fated to fall, or do they choose their path? And that's a very big question that's put out in the play of Macbeth that we will explore as well. So is the supernatural a real force, or is it a symbol that represents inner weakness? And is there justice in the universe? These are big questions that Shakespeare loves to put out and to get the audience to think about. Okay, so this brings me on to the first sort of contextual point about the tragic genre that you could use in essays. There are some key words that we need to know, and they sound fancier than they are, so we'll go through them. A tragic play must first have a tragic hero. This is our main character, a protagonist. And this protagonist tends most often to begin as someone who's noble, begin as someone who's valued, has loved, brings strength, brings honor. So, for example, in Macbeth, we begin the play by meeting him in war or at the end of war. And people call him worthy gentleman. They call him worthy, they call him noble. He's seen as having a very high stature, except our tragic hero will often fall from grace. So by the end of the play, they will have committed several bad deeds, and suffered heavily for it. So it's a person who begins on high and takes a fall after doing very bad things. And they do so often because of a hamartia. And all this means is it's someone's tragic flaw. So in Macbeth, his hamartia, his flaw is ambition. He becomes overridden by ambition. He becomes overridden with this search for power. He wants to be king and he will do anything to get it. And that is his hamartia. He becomes overwhelmed by a desire to be king. Hubris, a fancy term for excessive pride. So this is when somebody has way too much pride that it causes them to basically stop thinking straight, and it causes them to fall down from grace. Peripeteia means a reversal of fortune. It's the moment in a play where things go wrong for our tragic hero. It's when the hero's fate becomes irreversible. So in Macbeth, it is arguably Act 3, Scene 4, where his peripeteia is shown. In Act 3, Scene 4, this is when he sees Banquo's ghost. And it's argued by many critics that that's the point when he realizes that he's too far gone to be forgiven, to come back, to be saved by God. So you could argue that's his reversal of fortune. The catastrophe is the final act of suffering. So we know in Macbeth that he dies at the end. That is his catastrophe. He suffers so much because of his hamartia of hubris, his excessive pride, that he ends up dying at the hands of Macduff. And then catharsis is by the end of the play, you should feel relief. There should be so much build-up of tension and suspense throughout the play that by the time you get to the end, you should feel relieved. You should feel, I'm so glad that's over. And you should often feel quite sad, especially for Macbeth, because we know that deep down, he probably wasn't a bad person. He experiences a lot of grief and guilt for what he did. So it's argued that maybe he's not an inherently awful person. And so you feel quite bad for him. And that is that catharsis. Okay. So often in the tragic genre, you will get themes running throughout the play. So these are just ideas that continually keep coming up throughout the play. So these could include ambition, power, the destructive power of love, madness, betrayal and deception, fate versus free will, morality and existence, appearance versus reality, revenge, violence, and guilt. Now, in Macbeth, the ones that we're specifically going to be focusing are the ones highlighted in white. So in this case, ambition, that's his hamartia, it's his fatal flaw. His hubris, his pride leads him to become overwhelmed by a search for power. The fate versus free will, and we'll look at this a little bit in the second half, is or was his actions, are they determined by the supernatural, the witches, or was it always inside him? Was it always human choice? So in Macbeth, obviously his downfall begins from the predictions of the witches. But was that the inciting force? Was it the reason that he went downhill? Or was it because he was always going to? Because he was the kind of person that became overwhelmed with power and ambition. Was that on him or was that fate? Appearance versus reality. Are things the way that they seem? So a good example of this is the scheming of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. They plot behind other people's backs. For example, the murder of Duncan, the murder or the attempted murder of Banquo's children. His best friend, they deceive his best friend, all for the search for power. Violence. There's loads of violence in Macbeth. The murder of Duncan is probably the biggest example of violence, but there are others. And guilt. Macbeth is a very guilty character. He shows many examples of guilt throughout the play. Okay. Right, let's move on to some other context then. So as I said, I want to reiterate, context will be about 15 to 20% of your entire literature grade. So it's worth really digging into this. Now, Shakespeare's Macbeth. Shakespeare didn't write Macbeth. He didn't come up with a story, as people believe. It was inspired by another set of historical texts called the Holinshed Chronicles. Now, Shakespeare's Macbeth is based on this text. It depicts the history of England and Scotland. However, in recent years, there has been debate as to whether these stories are actually true or if they're based in legend, whether they're actually just that, stories. And people are believing that it's not really historical facts, but it makes for an interesting story either way. Now, it is key to note that Shakespeare did make changes to the story. He didn't copy it outright. He did make the play more interesting. And the reason he did this was purely to emphasize a moral message. For example, that is what our tragedy is all about. He wanted to make the audience aware that falling into ambition and a search for power will lead to negative consequences. You will face punishment for doing sinful, bad things. So let's look at some of these changes then. One change, and probably the most important one, is that in the original text, Macbeth is actually perceived as quite a nice person. He's a very merciful and good king, and he rules for 10 years, despite committing some sins. However, Shakespeare writes Macbeth as short-lived. He presents him as quite an evil, cruel, tyrannical character, seeing him ascend to the throne much quicker than 10 years and fall much quicker than 10 years, and doing so through very questionably morally wrong means. Macbeth becomes king through violence and deception, through literally killing the other king, through deceiving his best friend, killing or having his best friend killed so that he can become king. That doesn't happen in the original story. A tragedy is defined by its moral message. So the reason Shakespeare did this, the reason he sped up Macbeth's trajectory and the corruption trajectory is because it enables Shakespeare to present him as a tragic hero, someone who starts high and ends down here. Shows him as someone who is flawed by his hamartia of ambition and therefore will fall as a result of those sinful actions. So not only do the audience leave feeling fear because they're scared that they shouldn't commit bad, sinful acts, but they also learn a lesson about the misuse of power. It makes the play more enjoyable and it emphasizes that emotional impact. And it also appeals to the king, which will explore why that is important in a second. Because the king was God's chosen ruler on earth. So Macbeth's violence acts to show the consequences of disrupting this divine order, and we'll come back onto this. Okay, second change. Banquo, in the original story, is actually an accomplice to the bad deeds of Macbeth. But in Shakespeare's version, he's actually an innocent, good character. Now, this change was done because it flatters the king. Simple as that. The king at the time was King James I, and he believed that he was distantly related to Banquo. So Shakespeare changed the character to be good to purely flatter the king, suggesting that his ancestry was virtuous and honorable. However, I guess it also does highlight the moral message of the play by creating this contrast between good and evil, this juxtaposition at the hands of fate. Both Macbeth and Banquo encounter the witches, except the way that they deal with the prophecies that they get is very much opposite. So Macbeth takes the prophecy and becomes overwhelmed with ambition. He starts murdering people, plotting to murder other people, doing terrible things, lying, deceiving. Whereas Banquo, he also receives prophecies, but he doesn't do bad things. He actually takes them and just exists. He's an honorable, lovely person. So by creating this contrast between good and evil, it highlights human flaw, it highlights human error and psychology, and presents that debate as to whether free will or fate was actually responsible for Macbeth's downfall. And this deepens the tragedy. Okay, so the divine right of kings. Now, at the time, people believed that the person who ruled England was chosen by God. They believed that the king's authority comes directly from God, not from the people. Nowadays, obviously, we have parliament. We pick the people to represent us. But back then in the sort of 1600s, they believed, or the general public believed, that the person who was king, that was chosen to rule, was chosen directly by God. They were God's representative on earth. So to go against the orders of the king was to go against God himself. And therefore, it was considered a sin. So questioning the king was a sin. Targeting the king was a sin. It was a crime. It was a legal crime to do this. And it would be punishable by capital punishment, by death, to even think about going against the will or orders of the king. So, when Macbeth kills Duncan, this is not only a legal crime because he murdered him, it's a religious one. This is why the world becomes disorientated and unbalanced. We see strange weather occurring, animals behaving badly. Macbeth's downfall occurs. He dies in the end. So we can take this idea, the divine right of kings, and we can apply it to Macbeth. Because this would have shocked an audience. It would have shocked a Shakespearean audience who believed that killing the king was a direct attack on God's plan. Macbeth's eventual downfall and torment reflect the belief that anyone who defines or defies the divine order will be punished, both spiritually and socially. So, we can also link this to the gunpowder plots. Now, in 1605, there was a conspiracy to kill King James I. Guy Fawkes, who we celebrate on November the 5th, set up a plot to blow up Parliament with the king in it, therefore killing the king. Now, this was a religious-based war against Catholics and Protestants, but it certainly reflects the importance of what happens in the play Macbeth. Now, King James I was already a monarch. He ruled in Scotland before England. Except in 1603, he became the King of England as well. And Macbeth was written in 1606, just after this attempted murder had happened in 1605. So this real-life act of attempted regicide, killing the king, made the themes of Macbeth extremely relevant. It shocked and scared a Shakespearean audience even more, because these fears were based in reality. So the play can almost be seen as a warning against treason, why you shouldn't kill the king, because it leads to consequences. It leads to your own death because you've gone against God. Macbeth's short, violent reign is filled with paranoia, bloodshed, and guilt, reflecting the chaos and horror that regicide can unleash. And the play would have reassured James I that those who betray or challenge the king will suffer divine and moral punishment. Okay. Now, on a very similar idea, we get something called the Great Chain of Being. This basically suggests that in life there's a hierarchy, God being at the top, followed by his angels, then the king or the queen, who is God's representative on earth, then the nobles, then the common people, then animals, plants, and rocks. This was the hierarchy. This was a God-given place on earth. And if you were to try and break out of your God-given place, it would lead to chaos in the world. People genuinely believed this. They believed that everyone had a place in life and you shouldn't overstep your boundaries. Now, Shakespeare shows that this disruption leads to chaos. We see in the play strange weather occurring, animals behaving violently, widespread disorder in Scotland. Macbeth himself begins to spiral mentally. He sees the hallucination of the dagger. He sees Banquo's ghost. He gets so paranoid. And that reflects the unnatural ambition and how it can corrupt the soul. But not only the soul, the life here on earth. Now, the play suggests that breaking this chain through pride or any other means leads to destruction in both the world and within the self. So we see this and we can bring this idea back up. Okay, right, let's make a move on. So, firstly, let's look at the witches. Now, James I, it's worth saying, was extremely interested in witches. He was almost obsessed with witches. He even wrote a book about it called Demonology, and he wrote this in 1597, where he broke down what he called the science of the supernatural. He believed that witches were linked to Satan, and so to become one, you must make a deal with the devil. Thus, witches were seen as not only sinful, but harmful against the church, against the king. So the book aimed to provide evidence of the existence of witches to the public and to inspire mass witch hunts, which justified killing innocent people who were believed to be in league with the devil. Now, upon publishing the book, the reported cases of witchcraft increased by 53%. That's a massive amount in that time. 53% doesn't seem a lot in terms of today's population, But back then, when the population of England was significantly less than it is now, 53% is a lot. Um, so that motivated James I to instill a new law that basically said that witchcraft was a felony. It was a legal crime that could be punished by death. So this book instilled fear in the general public, who feared falling into sinful traps and straying away from God. That's why he included, or Shakespeare included, witches in the play, because the general public would have been absolutely scared and terrified by even thinking about transcending their place out of the great chain, even going against God, committing one sinful act. People were scared of lying and stealing and murdering purely because they didn't want to be sent to eternal damnation in hell. Okay, so linking the witches to the great chain. Now, due to this divine order of the kings, James I was believed to be God's chosen ruler on earth. He believed that it was his imperative job to save the kingdom from the temptations of evil and witches. So being in league with Satan meant that witches opposed the great chain of being. They tried to transcend their place on earth, which therefore led to chaos. This breaking of the hierarchy of life meant that chaos was left in their wake. And in 1583, James I's future wife, Anne of Denmark, was unable to take her journey to England before their marriage. So what James decided to do was travel to Denmark to collect her. Except on his way back, James I's voyage suffered a terrible storm. And he believed that this was because of a supernatural attack on the crown. And this led to one of the largest witch hunts in history. When he got back, just in one town alone, he rounded up 70 suspects and tortured them into confessing, even if they weren't witches. He tortured them all into confessing to doing magical deeds. And this acted as a huge warning to all witches and sets up fear in Britain. Now, why were the witches actually used in Macbeth? What were the reasons for this? Well, one of them was simply to appeal to the king. By portraying the witches as evil, Shakespeare attempts to flatter the king, basically by aligning the play to his views. This would have instilled the audience with fear, as it acted as further evidence of the consequences of dealing with the supernatural. It was also to reflect the societal fears of the time. So witches were seen as a symbol of disorder. Witches in Macbeth embody chaos and temptation and the breakdown of the natural order, all of which were deeply feared by the general public. Now, their influence over Macbeth suggests that even the strongest of people, our noble, tragic hero, can fall prey to evil. And the audience very much would have taken this moral message and lived their life in fear of committing sins. And then finally, it was for dramatic purposes. So we'll look in 10 minutes or so. The witches actually open the play. They are the first characters that we as an audience meet in the play. So by introducing these supernatural forces immediately to the audience, it creates a sort of dark and ominous atmosphere to foreshadow the later dark events of the play. And they're used to propel the plot. They're the ones that give Macbeth and Banquo their prophecies. They quite literally manipulate the fate of Macbeth and his path. And that, I guess, opens the debate for free will. Were they the actual cause of his downfall? Did he do evil deeds because of them? Or did they just instill the fear? Did they just push him along the path that he was already meant to go down? And that's the debate of Macbeth. And then they serve as a moral warning to symbolize the dangers of listening to evil forces. Now, it is worth mentioning that to kind of add to this fate versus free will debate, the witches never actually directly tell Macbeth to do evil deeds. They never once directly say, go kill Duncan. They never say, kill your best friend Banquo. They never do that. They only give him the prophecy, which then Macbeth takes away and carries out himself. So it's worth having that in mind. Now, in terms of Greek mythology, the witches kind of, we could say, represent the fates in Greek mythology. So the fates were characters who the ancient Greeks believed could manipulate life. They could control the fate of human beings. So the witches mirror this because they are weavers of fate. They present or represent the cosmic forces beyond human control. However, it's worth saying that, again, this is one of our changes. Shakespeare actually transverts this classic concept. He doesn't actually say that they are the Greek fates. He actually presents them as active manipulators, unlike the fates, who don't actually manipulate anybody's life. They purely predetermine people's lives, whereas the witches actively get involved in Macbeth's fate. They instill him to make evil choices, whereas the Fates never once actually encounter humans. They simply predetermine people's lives. Okay, so let's look at the comparison between the two. Now, in terms of the actual role that they play, the old idea of the Greek Fates actually are controllers of destiny. They spin and measure and cut the thread of life. They make predetermined decisions, whereas Macbeth's witches are temptresses. They do not control fate, but they do manipulate and try and get Macbeth to make certain decisions and do certain things. In terms of their moral role, the Greek fates are neutral. They don't care about humanity. They don't interfere emotionally or morally. But what the witches do is that they are sinister. They are manipulative. They give Macbeth very ambiguous prophecies. They show him apparitions of floating heads, and they get him to think about doing certain evil acts. They find enjoyment in creating disorder and chaos, whereas our fates are very neutral. They don't really enjoy tempting fate. And in terms of free will, the Greek fates believed or are believed to have thought that humans are merely powerless against fate. They have no choice. It doesn't matter what they do in their life, their fate is predetermined. However, Macbeth's witches, they love the idea of free will. They actively try and get Macbeth to kill Duncan. They never tell him to do it, but they definitely instill him with the ambition to do so. Okay. So then that leads us on to our third and final change. In the original Holinshed Chronicles, the original source material for Macbeth, there are no witches. They don't exist. They are only described as goddesses of destiny. And it was thought that they represented more the neutral Greek fates rather than witches. However, Shakespeare changes them into what we call the Weird Sisters, which grounds them in this idea of evil satanic witchcraft. It gives them a dark, sinister, and malevolent edge compared to our neutral fates. This change was done because it preys on the audience's fears. It sets up the moral warning of the play. It shows us the consequences of breaking one's place in the order of life, the great chain. If you come out of your place, chaos roams. It also limits their power, which gives Macbeth choice. It highlights the debate as to whether free will or fate causes Macbeth's downfall. Imagine if the fates were actually kept in this story. Macbeth's life would be predetermined. It didn't matter what choices he made, he would be sentenced to hellish damnation. But by giving him choice, it almost emphasizes the moral message of the play. By giving him choice, it suggests to the audience that this might not be on the witches, that actually this is all human choice. It's all down to the human psychology, which therefore translates to the audience and instills them with more fear because they're scared then of making those same negative choices. So giving Macbeth choice presents him as being responsible for his own actions, which therefore emphasizes the consequence of ambition on the human mind. Okay, right, we're coming towards the end now, I promise. So Act 3, Scene 5, specific to the witches. It is interesting because Act 3, Scene 5 is thought to have been added at a later date. It's believed that Shakespeare didn't actually write this scene, that it was added by another author years down the line. And there are several clues as to whether this is the case or not. Purely in the tone and the style of writing, it doesn't seem like Shakespeare's typical style of writing. He also introduces a new character called Hecate without any context. So it just seems weird that we've got this new sort of subplot forming without anywhere to go. But the reason this is significant contextually is because it's a scene about the witches. It's a scene where the witches' motivations are made clear. The audience is told why the witches are doing what they're doing. So in Act 1, when we meet them on the heath, we're not sure as to why they're trying to manipulate Macbeth. But in Act 3, this character of Hecate states that they should draw him into his confusion, suggesting that they should trick Macbeth into a false confidence. Their motivation is to actively manipulate and destroy Macbeth. This makes them more sinister, presents them as evil, therefore emphasizing James I's belief. And they also set up a moral lesson. So this scene foreshadows Macbeth's downfall in the next act, in Act 4, by further establishing that Macbeth has choice rather than being predetermined by fate. This emphasizes his hamartia, his fatal flaw of excessive pride, hubris, suggesting that overconfidence is dangerous, and it teaches the audience a lesson about overstepping one's place in the great chain as that leads to chaos. Hecate mentions that security is moral's chiefest enemy, stating quite directly that recklessness brings danger. So, from an audience perspective, we're literally seeing evil supernatural spirits quite literally telling us that doing evil sins or committing evil sins is going to lead to bad consequences. So we're hearing it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. By hearing it from the evil itself, it's instilling us with more fear not to do those sinful things. Okay, let's speed this through. Got 3 more to go through, and then we'll take a very quick break before moving on to the witches. So religion at the time. Now, Protestants and Catholics, what about at the time? We don't really need to go into the debate of Protestants versus Catholics, but around the time that Macbeth was written, there was a transformation period where Queen the First, who was the previous Queen, Elizabeth I, sorry, was Catholic. However, the new James I, King of England, was Protestant. And so there was a debate as to what the general public should be. So Shakespeare plays on this in 3 different ways. Throughout the play, there are loads of religious allusions. A couple of weeks ago, when we did our revision session on English language, do you remember doing a language technique called allusion? This is where the audience knows about something that is mentioned, and they have ideas about that thing. So, for example, in Macbeth, you get loads of allusions to biblical stories. For example, you get the snake in the Garden of Eden. And obviously at the time, the audience knew of that story. They knew the snake was evil. There was representative of disloyalty, of deception. And so therefore, we're going to take those ideas about deception and disloyalty and apply them to what we think about the characters in the play. So the allusions act to sort of add depth to a character in terms of what we should think about those characters. Therefore, emphasizing moral lessons. Okay, he also emphasizes the idea of predestination versus free will. So what we've just talked about. Predestination is the belief that our lives have already been determined. There's nothing that we can do to change the trajectory of our lives. Our lives are determined before birth. However, free will is the idea that we have choice, that actually we can determine our own fate. And that debate is sort of created, as we've just talked about in Macbeth, between whether the witches are the cause or whether it's Macbeth's own ambition. And then this idea of forgiveness. There's a debate between Catholics and Protestants as to whether suffering is required for forgiveness from God. And at what point is forgiveness unachievable? Now, we talked about peripeteia, and I said it's debate as to where it comes in the play. I personally, and many critics, think it is Act 3, Scene 4, when Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost. And I think this is the point when Macbeth realizes that he's too far gone for forgiveness. He's done too many terrible things for God to forgive him, for him to not be able to get into heaven. And it's worth mentioning that even by the end of the play, Macbeth never asks for forgiveness. He does, however, accept that he is damned, suggesting that even he knows that he's too far gone to be forgiven by God. He's going to be in hell. either way. So this establishes the moral lesson of the play. Don't do bad things. Don't transcend the great chain of being. Don't go against the divine right of kings, because you're not going to be accepted into heaven. You're not going to be saved by God. Okay, last two things. Gender then. In Jacobean England, which is what we call the rule of James I, there were certain gender expectations at the time. So men held authority. And in not only in public but in private life. And women were expected to be obedient, silent, and domestic. Now, the ideal woman was chaste and modest and nurturing and submissive, modeled after the Virgin Mary. Women were seen as sort of morally weaker and more easily influenced by evil, hence often linking to this idea of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Now, gender in Macbeth. We often see a good example is Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth literally calls on supernatural spirits to unsex me here. This is the idea that she rejects femininity in order to gain power, in order to overcome her boundaries, break her place in the great chain of being. Same with the witches. They're literally, and we'll see this a bit later, they're described as having male physical traits. They break conventional gender norms. And by doing this, again, they're shown as breaking this great chain of being, this divine order, therefore leading to chaos. Macbeth's masculinity is manipulated by Lady Macbeth. She uses his manhood to push him into doing evil deeds such as murder. And often violent ambition was seen as a masculine trait. And the play connects power and cruelty with traditional male strength. So in terms of Shakespeare's commentary on the play, he likes to challenge rigid gender roles. So the character of Lady Macbeth and the witches hold influence, but therefore, because they've broken their place in the great chain, will suffer for it. As we know by the end of the play, Lady Macbeth commits suicide. That's her punishment for breaking her place. He also shows dangers of overstepping roles, of rejecting the natural order, and he explores gender as performance. Okay, finally then, and then we'll have a quick break and move on. The four humours. This is not something that many teachers teach, but I love the idea of the four humours. It's not widely explored in Macbeth. There is only certain specific quotes, but I think it's important nonetheless. So the four humours were the idea in medicine that the human body was governed by four different bodily fluids. So blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. And a balanced person had all four of these in harmony, leading to a kind, balanced, all-rounded human being. Now, each of these fluids was linked to a certain characteristic. So blood was linked to someone who was optimistic, who was outgoing, who was extroverted. Yellow bile was linked to anger, ambition. Black bile was linked to sadness and introspective thought, someone who thinks a lot. Phlegm was linked to being calm and unemotional. Now we see this in the character of Macbeth. He displays the symptoms of yellow bile, someone who's angry and drawn by ambition. He also shows black bile, someone who's associated with guilt and disturbances. So we see this in many of his soliloquies. His hallucinations, his paranoia, his emotional instability suggest that he's got a psychological imbalance and he's collapsed because of his violent actions. We also see this in Act 1 when Lady Macbeth says to Macbeth that he is too full of the milk of human kindness. What she's really saying to him, if we translate it into modern day English, is that his humours are off balance. This idea of the milk can be linked to the blood. So when she's saying milk, she's saying your humours are off balance. You've got too much blood. You're too kind. You're too optimistic to do these evil deeds that I want you to do. She says that he should get rid of milk. He should lower his blood so that he can become more angry and full of ambition. She wants him to gain yellow bile. She wants him to become violent in order to become king. And she also links the four humours to herself. She appears to suffer with an excess of black bile, of someone who's sad and introspective. Her desire to be unsexed and filled from the crown to the toe top of diarist cruelty suggests a rejection of her natural balance of humours in favour of an unnatural and dangerous ambition. She says, "Make thick my blood, and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers." Now, she literally uses the word blood. She's literally saying, "Make thick my blood, get rid of all my happiness, my optimism, my kindness." She's saying, "Take my milk, my blood, and replace it for gall," which is bile. It literally translates to bile. So she's literally saying, "Make my kindness of the blood into this yellow and black bile. Make me an angry, ambitious person," which we can link to gender roles. So this is a metaphor for her descent into tyranny as she transgresses against the natural order of balanced humors. Right, okay then. What we're going to do is it's going to take 2 minutes. I know this has been a lot. It's been a lot to give you, but I promise you this is useful. I promise you you will use this. It's 20% of your overall literature mark. So what we're going to do after the break then is we're going to look specifically at the witches. But I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to take a breather, then we'll come back because I know this has been a lot, but well done for sticking in with me. I think it's also just to mention, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat, by the way. I haven't been checking the chat, but I will do. Right then. Okay, thank you for everyone who stuck with me. So in the second half, and we're only going to go to about quarter to today. So let's take the next 40 minutes or so to go over what your literature exam will look like, firstly. So in terms of Macbeth, it will come in section A. It will come in the first part of paper one of literature if you're doing AQA. And in paper one, you will be given an extract from one scene of the play and be asked a question specifically about Shakespeare Presents XYZ. So he could ask you, or the exam could ask you to how Shakespeare presents. It could be a theme, or it could be a character. It could be a contextual question. It could be anything that you've studied to do with Macbeth. Now you'll see on the right I've put a general mark scheme. It tells us that 30 marks are for this question, and they were an additional 4 marks for spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Now, there are 12 out of those 13 marks for AO1, and what that means is your ability to make points. Can you perceive things about characters, about themes? Question AO2, your assessment objective 2, is 12 marks also, about 40% of the marks. And it's testing your ability to analyze language and structure. So very much linking to what we did about a few weeks ago when we looked at language and structural devices. Can you analyze quotes? Some people forget that for literature, you still need quotes and we still need language and structural analysis on a perceptive level. And we'll look at this again in a sec. And then 6 marks out of the 30 of a context, which is about 20% of that. But for section A, only Macbeth, you do get a spelling, punctuation, and grammar mark. And you only get this for question 1 of paper 1 and question 1 of paper 2. So that's why I've not included it in the general percentage. Otherwise, the percentages would shift a little bit. But let's just look briefly at what you need to do to get the higher mark. So to get in the sort of level 6, 26 to 30 marks, in order to make points, it literally says that you need to conceptualize the point. Basically, have you been critical? Have you been thorough? Have you explained in detail your points? Have you made unique points that other people haven't made? For AO2 then, it tells you you must analyze writers' methods, specifically making or marking subject terminology. It says judiciously. That just means a large range. Have you picked lots of different ones instead of just naming the same few? Have you talked about personification, but also metaphors, similes, alliteration, repetition? Have you used a range of language devices? Have you talked about the whole play rather than just the extract? Have you managed to expand your answer? And then AO3, have you been able to explore ideas, perspectives, and contextual factors regarding detailed links between context relating specifically to the task? So I gave you an example question from 2023, I think this was. So it says, starting with this conversation, explore how Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a male character who changes. So this is an example. It could be about a character linked to a theme. So it's about A, Macbeth as a character, and B, him in terms of gender. And I've highlighted start with this conversation because always make sure to look at exactly where it is guiding you to answer the question. Okay. So a lot of people over the last few weeks have been asking me about P-TECH paragraphs. I use Peter, but that's only when I'm doing language. In terms of literature, P-TECH is the one that you want. So the first 4 stages are still the same. It's our point, evidence, technique, and explain, except instead of the reader, it's about our context. It's about our context, linking to what we've just discussed, the wider themes of the play, what was going on at the time, why is that relevant to the question? So in the example that we just read, it was about Macbeth as a male character. Have you linked it to gender norms at the time? Have you thought about how him subverting those gender norms breaks the great chain of being? It goes against the divine rights. Okay, so a brief reminder of our P-TECH paragraphs. Our point basically wants us to tell the marker what the writer is trying to show. So, for example, I put the writer presents the character as isolated, making a basic point about what your quote that you're picking out is trying to show, and supporting that with relevant evidence. So, for example, he sat alone in the dark, just something that supports your point from the text. Name a specific technique. Please name your techniques. The amount of answers that I mark where people haven't specifically written the terminology. We just saw in the mark scheme, it asks you to accurately and judiciously mark subject terminology. Please do this because it gets you into the higher bands. So have you named the techniques? Was it a simile? Was it metaphor? Was it juxtaposition? Was it a structural technique? Then add an explanation. So talk about the connotations. What did you think about when you thought of that word? What will the audience of that time think about? What were they feeling? What are you feeling when you think of that word? And then context. How would a Jacobean audience have interpreted what's going on in the play from that quote? Um, no, I'm not going through maths today. This is specifically English related. I think Mr. Siddiqui has been doing a maths revision at the same time. So if you're looking for maths revision, it's another link. It's not my link. And do you have any analysis on the characters and themes? I do, actually, if you want it. Um, email the business email, and yeah, I'm happy to get it to you. I do have analysis on characters and themes if you want it. But we'll be going through some today and over the next few weeks as well. So, okay, language revision. I just thought let's briefly go over our language devices because, as we just saw, we need to name them. This is very similar to what's required of you in English language. So, we're not going to spend much time on this because I want to move forward. But alliteration, repeating same letters. Allusion, we talked about. Has Shakespeare referred to something the audience knows about? Can we take our associations with that thing and link it to what was going on at the time, to something about our characters? Do we learn more about our characters? The anaphora, the repeating of sentence starters, the colloquialisms, our slang terms, a consonant lexis is something sibilant. Do we get those repeated S sounds? Do we get the plosive lexis, the B, the D, the P's, the hard and aggressive sounds? Do we get the fricative lexis? Do we get those F's and those C's and those T's that sound jarring and harsh? Do we get emotive language? Do we get a language that makes us as an audience member feel a certain way about the characters? Euphemisms, they're sort of nicer ways of saying something. Do we get hyperbole, exaggeration? Do we get imagery? If you can see it in your head, it's imagery. I say it all the time, but I want to just emphasize that if you can see it in your head, it is imagery. And the imagery will come up about 80% of the time. It helps a reader visualize and experience what's going on in more depth. Irony, specifically dramatic irony. Do we as an audience member know something that the characters don't know? A metaphor is something described as being something else. Onomatopoeia, have we got sounds for things? An oxymoron, have we got conflicting word choices? Has something been personified and given human qualities? Has something been repeated? Have we got rhetorical questions? Have we got things compared to other things with like or as similes? And do things represent larger ideas? All of these things can be linked to quotes in Macbeth. And if you want revision on these, about 2 weeks ago, I did an in-depth cover of all of these. And I will continue to do an in-depth cover of certain ones each week. So I keep coming back for those. And then finally, we talked about tone and atmosphere. How does the writing make an audience member feel? What does it make you think of? The rule of three, repeating, have a list of 3 things. Juxtaposition, contrasting ideas. And then a semantic field where words are within the same theme. Okay, sorry it's a bit of a rush to get over these, but I want to move on to some actual quote analysis. Well, so, as a sort of basic plot summary, just a reminder for you of what actually goes on in Macbeth. And this is a very, very basic view of the plot. So Macbeth is a tragedy. We discussed the tragic genre in the last hour. It's about a brave Scottish general named Macbeth. After winning a battle, he meets 3 witches who prophesize that he will become the king of Scotland. Now, encouraged by this prophecy and pushed by his ambitious wife, Lady Macbeth, he murders the current king, Duncan, and takes the throne. However, Macbeth becomes paranoid and starts killing everyone he sees as a threat, including his friend, Banquo, and Macduff's family. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth is consumed by guilt and goes mad. Macbeth's rule becomes increasingly violent and unstable, and in the end, Macduff leads an army against Macbeth. Macbeth is killed in battle, and Malcolm, Duncan's son, becomes king, restoring order to England. Other than Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, can you get a question on any other character? You can. It probably won't be. I'd argue Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have been the two that have come up multiple times. On the syllabus, the witches are named as a character or a set of characters that could come up as a question, and Banquo. But I don't think out of those four there will be any others, and you'd be very unlucky to get Banquo. But I think it'd be more likely that you get asked theme. So it could be about, for example, this year's question was about how ambition is shown in Macbeth, but you could get asked about power or guilt or duality. But yeah, but I prepare for the witches because that could come up and it hasn't yet. And they have been named on the syllabus as a character that, or a set of characters that could come up. So that's why we're doing the witches today, because the witches start the play. They're only shown in 4 different scenes of the play. And as a brief reminder of the role of the witches were these 3 things. They appeal to the king, they reflect the societal fears of the time, and serve a dramatic purpose to push the plot of the play, to push Macbeth into doing evil things, which therefore leads to his fatal downfall. And they serve as a moral warning. Okay. Now, it's worth as our first sort of AO2 language structural analysis point. Most of Macbeth and most of Shakespeare's plays are written in what we call iambic pentameter. This is normally noted to or given to more noble characters. So characters with good intention speak in iambic pentameter. That's just a rhythm. So if I was to speak a sentence, it would be a rhythm of that sentence. And iambic pentameter is a rhythm of 10 syllables, unstressed, then stressed. So like this, I would be talking like that, would be iambic pentameter. And people or characters who are given that often reflect order and control and status. So for example, King Duncan, Banquo, early Macbeth in the play. However, Shakespeare's clever because what he does is he transverts and plays on this rhythm of the sentence. And we find that later down the line, when he becomes overcome with guilt and ambition and power, he actually begins to speak in rhyme rather than iambic pentameter and rhyming couplets. And the reason is because it's symbolic that he's changed, that he's become evil. And other characters that also speak like this are the witches. So by him speaking like this, he's begun to mirror the witches, who we saw in the last hour contextually represent evil against God, a breaking of the great chain of being. The witches speak in rhyming couplets. So, for example, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. This unusual meter of rhyming couplets make their speech sound like spells and chants, therefore creating unease and fear in the audience. And it gives a purpose to the characters that speak like this. So characters that speak in rhyming couplets often represent evil, people who are doing sinful acts against God. Okay, so we first see the witches in Act 1, Scene 1. They literally open the play. The witches are introduced amid thunder and lightning, immediately setting a dark and unnatural tone. This establishes ideas that there may be an inversion of natural order, which foreshadows their role in influencing Macbeth. They are presented as an ominous force against the natural world, which instills fear in a Jacobean audience. So it's important that they are the first characters that we meet as an audience at the start of the play, because it gives the audience a sense of something negative going to happen later down the line. So I've given some examples of some quotes that I've begun to do the work for. I was going to spend some more time on these, but I'm not sure we'll have that much time to go through them. But we'll go through a couple. So I've given some examples of how you can start picking language analysis out of these. So one of the very first quotes that the witches are introduced with is when shall we 3 meet again in thunder, lightning, or in rain. So the things that I've picked out in blue here, there's the mention of weather, specifically thunder, lightning, and rain, all negative types of weather. And we call that pathetic fallacy. It's when we use stormy weather to represent chaos and evil or something negative going to happen. So Shakespeare uses this pathetic fallacy to reflect the unnatural disturbances that the witches cause in the world. The violent weather sets a dark and ominous tone for the play and hints at the moral and political disorder to come. You also get this lovely rule of three. You get the thunder, the lightning, and then the rain. This rhythm emphasizes this idea of negative weather. By placing stressed focus on the thunder and the lightning, it emphasizes or reinforces this idea that the natural order of the world has been broken, that's being disturbed. It highlights how the witches operate under dark and violent environments, suggested that they are away from the normal divine order of the world. And then we get this question as well: when shall we three meet again? So it creates a sense of mystery early doors for the character of the play. Okay. Right. So I also highlighted in also the very beginning of the play, when the battle's lost and won, fair is foul and foul is fair. Now, this is the most famous quote from the Witches and is key to our language analysis. So let's begin with the lost and won. This is an example of an oxymoron. Those two contrasting words that cannot be. You cannot lose and win at the same time, but it's done for a reason. It creates this sort of deceptive idea, this idea that the witches are a force of evil, that they're there to manipulate, they're there to create ambiguity, they're there to confuse. It creates a sense of moral ambiguity, which therefore sets them up as this evil force in the play. We also get this foreshadowing from it that implies that Macbeth's coming victory will also be his downfall. It sets him up as our tragic hero in the play. We also then get this second oxymoron. The fair is foul. You can't be those two things at the same time. Now, we get this thing called chiasmus, and this means when we mirror things in reverse order. So foul is fair, fair is foul, sorry, foul is fair. We get a reversal of these two things, a mirroring. So we get, on a metaphorical level, this represents inverted corruption in the world. So very much like how the sentence has been flipped around, the world has been as well. It represents that they are reversing the natural order of the world. They're breaking the great chain of being. They're corrupting Macbeth, much like how they're corrupting the language of the world. And then as well, we get this repeated repeated F consonant. And we call that a fricative alliteration. So remember, the fricative sounds are the F, C's, and T's. Well, F, the fricative, and it's quite a harsh sound. The reason we repeat this F sound is it actually creates quite an eerie tone. So on a metaphorical level or a symbolic level, it represents evil intent because that F sound is quite forceful. We tend to use or see F sounds used when it's sort of deceptive and manipulative context, when things are supposed to be quite hard-hitting and harsh. So the fact that Shakespeare has used this repeated F sound enhances the idea or reinforces the idea that the witches are an evil force, that they're there to spite Macbeth, they're there to create disorder. So not only through the reversal of the paradoxal sentence structure, but through the use of syllables, that they've stressed this F, this harsh sound, and very much like them, they are harsh. Okay. So we next see them in Act 1, Scene 3. And this is probably the most important time that we see them because they appear to Macbeth and Banquo to deliver their prophecies. They tell Macbeth that he will be the Thane of Glamis, the Thane of Cawdor, and the future king. They instill him with the idea that he's going to have a successful future. So this is if we're thinking about our story arc, this would be our inciting incident. This is the moment where our protagonist gets instilled with ambition. He gets told he's going to be the future king. However, the witches also tell Banquo that his sons will be king. So this makes Macbeth worried because Macbeth wants to be king, but there's a conflicting prophecy suggesting that he might not be king for very long, or even his sons or future sons be kings either. And so this makes Macbeth paranoid. It motivates Macbeth to begin to obsess over power. He wants to stay king, and he'll do anything to stay king. It's important, again, to note, though, however, that the witches never directly tell Macbeth to kill Duncan. They never directly tell him to murder Banquo. They simply instill him with the ambition. And therefore, it presents the question of predestination versus free will. Did they cause him to do these evil things, or was he always going to do it? Okay. Because this scene is quite a long scene, there are several or a list of quotes that you could remember for the exam. I'm only going to go through a few of these just as an examples. But if you want to screenshot them, if you want to take them for your revision, these are good ones to have for the exam. I've picked them out especially because they're good for language analysis. They're good for structure analysis. So I'll give you a few seconds if you want to take them. Okay. If you didn't get time to take them, put it in the chat and I'm happy to go back. Okay, so the first one that I've gone for is said by Banquo about the witches. He says that they are so withered and wildly dressed. They look not like the inhabitants of the earth and yet are on it. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. So there's a few things we could pick out from this. I mean, contextually, we could link this to gender and the great chain of being. The fact that they've literally got male features. He says that they've got beards, which are stereotypically related to more masculine features. So we could say that on a language level, this is symbolism. The beards are a symbol of masculinity. Their presence blurs gender identity. This gender ambiguity challenges Jacobean gender roles contextually, where physical appearance defined identity. The witches' gender confusion on a symbolic level reflects the inversion of this natural order, this great chain of being. Their place is to be a woman. That at that time is what they believed, is what the Jacobean audience believed. But by having beards, it's suggesting that they're trying to move places on this divine order. And the consequence of that, chaos, evil, satanic, demonic things. So beards are a symbol of masculinity and therefore reflect the witch's evil intentions. We also get this personification of the beards. It's almost as if Shakespeare presents the beards as being a human or having human qualities. So he uses this verb of forbid, this imperative verb, to give the beards a sort of metaphoric power almost, giving the beards authority, as if they're trying to define the gender roles of these characters. And this emphasis basically emphasizes how disturbing and unnatural their appearance actually is. It's against natural logic. Beards should not be personified. And so it almost emphasizes this idea that they're there to transvert the normal order of the world. We also get this description of the withered look, the wildly dressed. We get the adjective withered, which implies connotations of decay and aging, therefore highlighting our context of the great chain of being. They're unnatural, they're not realm. We also get the verb of wild, the adverb, sorry, of wildly, which implies chaos, which almost foreshadows or tells the audience that they're going to be evil forces of chaos. They're going to bring disorder. They're going to corrupt our main protagonist. And then finally, we get this juxtaposition. He says that they're not like the inhabitants of the earth. They're not like humans. And yet they live with us on earth. This juxtaposition of something that shouldn't be this contrast. This highlights the irony of the witch's existence. They are almost liminal figures. They exist between life and death. They don't belong on earth with us humans. And therefore, this presents to the audience, again, reinforces the idea that they are evil. They don't belong. They're here to create disruption and chaos. Okay. Okay. They also later appear in Act 3, Scene 5, where Hecate appears to scold the witches for meddling in Macbeth's fate. She instructs them to meet Macbeth again the next day and show him false visions that will diminish his overconfidence and confuse him. In doing so, they provide him with a false sense of security. And this scene builds suspense as it reveals that the witches are not just mystical beings reacting to fate, but they are actively manipulating Macbeth's story towards self-destruction. Introducing Hecate adds a depth to the witches by establishing supernatural hierarchy. Hecate is literally the goddess of witches and evil. So again, I've highlighted this. Obviously, this scene's not as big, but I've highlighted some key quotes that you could talk about, and we'll go through one together. This links to the context of The Witches, remember, because Act 3, Scene 5 is supposed to have not been written by Shakespeare. It's believed to have been written externally years later. So the idea that this randomly introduced Hecate character has meaning. It's been done for a reason. It's supposed to emphasize moral message or the moral message of the play. So the one that I picked out was, "You all know security is mortal's chiefest enemy." Let's begin to unpack this. So the idea of security. Now, on a literal level, let's think about our perceptive answers. Security is safety. It's something where you feel safe. But on a metaphorical level, what Hecate or Shakespearean writing actually means is state of mind. What she's really saying is, you all know overconfidence or having too much confidence is what's going to bring downfall. That's what this sort of sentence translates to. So the idea of the abstract noun of security almost symbolizes a state of mind. It's not literal security. It's overconfidence. This idea that Macbeth is full of hubris, he's full of pride. And that security refers to metaphoric peace that comes with human confidence. Except she's saying that on an ironic level, overconfidence is all great and well, but it can lead to your downfall as well as it being a comfortable feeling. Security can make you feel complacent and vulnerable just as much as it can protect you. And so by saying this quote, she's emphasizing to the audience the moral message of this play. She's highlighting that Macbeth's fatal flaw of hubris, of pride, is what's gonna kill him in the end. So the audience are going to take that away and they're going to reflect on their own lives. They're going to say, we don't want to commit this sinful behavior because now we're scared that we're going to be sentenced to hell damnation. We also see this idea of the sort of superlative. And what I mean by superlatives is when you say something is the most. So it's the chiefest, it's the largest it can be. So he uses this sort of superlative of the chiefest. Now, let's think of the chief. In modern English, a chief is someone who's a leader. It's someone who orders, particularly in battle. So by using the superlative, it emphasizes that the worst that it is, or overconfidence, is the worst danger of all. It's going to lead to Macbeth's downfall. It highlights how deadly pride and arrogance can be, therefore highlighting the moral message of the play. That if you are to break the place in a great chain of being, it will lead to severe consequences, particularly hell damnation. You're not going to be saved or forgiven by God. And then we also get this sort of semantic field of war, words within the same genre or theme. So here we get this sort of like warlike imagery. So the security of the overconfidence, the chief, the enemy. We get this idea of war and battle. It gives us imagery. Can you see it in your heads? It's imagery. Therefore, almost presenting overconfidence as being like a leader in battle. It's something that should be feared. It's something that you should avoid. Otherwise, much like the general in a battle, it can destroy you and it will destroy you. So this almost foreshadows Macbeth's fatal downfall because he's full of overconfidence. He's overcome with pride and ambition. So by presenting pride as being this sort of like battle force or this strong force, it's almost presenting or solidifying Macbeth's downfall. It's saying he's overcome by pride, therefore he's now destined himself to die. And then you get this almost personification of the overconfidence. Like it's an enemy. It's presented with human-like qualities. Also linking it to this warlike imagery. This presents the struggles of mankind. It reinforces the moral message of the play. It gives overconfidence a cosmic context, presenting it as an overwhelming force which foreshadows Macbeth's downfall. Ironically, he is now an enemy of God. He's broken the great chain of being. He's done sinful acts and therefore will not be forgiven in the eyes of God. He is too far gone to be saved. He's overstepped his place in the great chain. Okay, so let me just answer these questions. Who is Hecate? In mythology, Hecate is thought to be the goddess of witches and witchcraft. So think of her as being like the leader of the witches. She only appears in that one scene, and again, we think it was written later than 1606 when Macbeth was actually written. And her role is purely to emphasize the moral message. It's purely to make the audience think that committing sins is going to lead to eternal damnation. It's going to scare the audience into not going against the king. Can you link that quote to another one from part of that text? Let me think off the top of my head. I'm talking about security is the chiefest enemy. Think. We're going to cover Macbeth, but the character of Macbeth later down the line. And I think you benefit from coming back to that one because there are quite a lot of Macbeth's quotes where we could link this idea of overconfidence to that. So, for example, in Act 5, when he undergoes or towards the end of his life, he talks about the simile of being almost like a bear tied to a pole. And this is the idea that he's become so overconfident that he feels isolated, he's trapped, that his fate is inescapable. And so that's quite good to link to sort of like later Act 5 quotes that we will cover. Okay. And then finally, they appear in Act 4, Scene 1, which is the final time we see the witches. And in this scene, they present to Macbeth three apparitions, hallucinations, an armed head, a bloody child, and a child crowned with a thorny tree. They also show him a vision of 8 kings who are supposed to represent Banquo's descendants. These apparitions fuel Macbeth's paranoia as he becomes increasingly tyrannical and murderous. And this scene marks Macbeth's complete dependence on the supernatural as they take full control of Macbeth's fate. And these prophecies are technically true, but they are misleading. And again, if you want to screenshot some of these quotes, these are the good ones from Act 4, Scene 1, and I'll give you a few seconds to do this, and then we'll go through our final quote of the day. Okay, again, if you haven't got these and you want them, put in the chat and I will go back. So what other texts can we study at GCSE level? Will we cover them during these lessons? So the way that your exam is sort of broken down is if you're doing AQA, and it's very similar with Edexcel, you cover one Shakespeare play, and 90% of people will do Macbeth. Other people do Romeo and Juliet. I personally don't teach Romeo and Juliet. I only do Macbeth. You also go through like a 19th century Victorian novel, which is of the Gothic genre, hence why we covered it last week. And most people either do Jekyll and Hyde or A Christmas Carol. So I personally teach Jekyll and Hyde. And if that would benefit people, I will. I'm happy to cover Jekyll and Hyde. I do teach it. And then you will also do a modern day play. So that'll be sort of the crime genre. Most people study in Inspector Calls, which again, I'm happy to go over, people want. And then poetry, which you'll either do sort of like war or love poems. But yeah, in terms of Shakespeare plays, most people study Macbeth. Okay, so this last one, which we'll do together, is sweltered venom like a hell broth boil. So let's begin to pick this quote apart. Is there any language structures we can pick out of this? Firstly, let's focus on this idea of venom. When we think of venom, we think, at least I think of snakes. which almost in contextual levels, we talked about the religious illusions. One very common religious story is about the Garden of Eden. And what do we find in the Garden of Eden? We find the disloyal snake. So the snake who shows deception, who manipulates Adam and Eve. So this idea of venom also highlights, therefore, we can say, moral corruption. And in terms of language techniques, we can say that's firstly a metaphor, because it is something else, but then it also symbolizes moral corruption. So it's a symbol as well as a metaphor. We get then emphasized. Think about our sounds of words. We get this sweltered venom. How does that sweltered sound emphasize this idea of disloyalty and moral corruption? Often we find sibilant sounds. So these are our sort of repeating S sounds. Here, we talked about the snake. Snakes obviously have or use that hissing sound. So it's almost as if the sibilant sound mimics the snake, which reinforces this religious illusion. Therefore, the audience are very much aware at that time the story of Adam and Eve. So it almost acts as a moral lesson. It teaches the audience not to fall or follow the supernatural, because it will lead to chaos, as did that story. So it will lead to chaos, breaking the natural great chain of being. Okay, the S sound also contributes to the sort of evil sort of sound. It sort of emphasizes this deceptive force by making you feel uncomfortable. It's unsettling, uncomfortable, uneasy. Okay. Again, the snake gives us this hellish imagery, this idea of hell, which again is there to scare the audience to not commit sins, otherwise they go into eternal damnation. And we even get the mention of hell in the simile, like a hell broth boil. So, simile of hell. Now, why have we got this? It creates this idea of punishment. People get sent to hell because they've committed bad deeds. They're there to be damned for eternity. So, eternal damnation as punishment for their sins. So, that almost foreshadows, therefore, Macbeth's downfall. They talk about the broth boil. We've got more Lexis there. We've got this time a double B alliteration, and we call that the sort of a plosive alliteration. Now, we use plotive sounds because they're hard hitting. We can link this to the deceptive idea of the witches. They're there to punish, they're there to create chaos, which is hard hitting sounds. So it emphasizes this idea of punishment again, this malice created by the witches as an evil force. And then finally, the imagery of the boiling. When we think of boiling, we think of heat and pressure, very much symbolizing or linking to the pressure placed on Macbeth, that they are a corrupting force. They are there to influence Macbeth in a very negative way. So they are corrupting force, very much how you get this idea of boiling and heat and pressure. And much like heat, they can do damage to people's lives, linking therefore to chaos in the great chain of being. They are there to corrupt and disrupt the natural order of life, therefore leading to chaos. And therefore it is a religious moral message to the audience not to sin. Okay, then let me finish reading the chats and then it's us done for today. So yes, we get a simile because of the like. So sibilance. In this context, I would say it mirrors religion because of the idea of the snake. In the Garden of Eden, the snake is a deceptive force. It corrupts Adam and Eve and makes them do sinful things. They fall into temptation. It symbolizes temptation in a negative way. And so this S sound almost reminds the reader of that story. Much like in modern day society, when we call people snakes, it's because they're deceptive. They go behind people's backs. They make bad things happen. So the S sound mimics the hissing sound of the snake, therefore reminding the reader or alluding to that story. Okay, then. That is us done for today, then. Please come back next week and we'll continue looking at both language and structure in terms of your. Yeah, I'll see you next week then.